fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. You get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone fixed me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're back with friend of the show, R.C. Roberts, writer extraordinaire, and we're continuing our talk about Wilfred Bion, the British psychoanalytic theorist. So today I think we're going to focus in a little bit on group dynamics and on reversible perspectives and its relationship to ideology. So how does that sound for you as a way to begin?
Yeah, that's good. We'll see if I can keep up this time.
All right. So let's talk about some of Wilfred Bion's implications for ideological analysis. Why do you think understanding Bion's form of psychoanalytic theory is helpful to understanding the way ideology does or does not function?
Well, the first thing that I think is very interesting, or at least has some implications if you use Bionian psychoanalysis for ideology, is Bion spends a good amount of time breaking down his understanding of what he thinks thinking and thoughts are.
Mm-hmm.
For example, he thinks that the infant is born with thoughts, but not with the ability to think. And so ultimately, he argues that the first way you learn how to think is by borrowing the thinking of your mother in the case of object relations, or I guess you could say caretaker, whoever spends the most time with you.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of where thinking begins. Thinking is not this original sort of, let's say, Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, kind of belongs to you. It's something that's passed on. It's something that you pick up. It's something you mimic. And so ultimately, from the very beginning, let's say, to be kind of cynical about it, you're already infiltrated by whatever ideology surrounds you. One might even say that your class infects you from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're borrowing it from the people who take care of you. And so
so this is what like standard sociologists would call your habitus, right? The class environment and culture that has informed your worldview already.
Right. And what's interesting about that for me is, first off, you have to unite that with something else that Bion thinks of, which is that he doesn't see thinking as a way of gaining knowledge, or, to use Sartrean terminology, of revealing the world. He thinks that all thinking, regardless of what it is a form of coping. It's a way of taking the reality that's around you that you can't escape, to be existentialist again, the reality that's constantly bombarding you with sensory datum. Thinking isn't a way to necessarily organize that or to understand it or even to get to the truth necessarily. It's all about trying to cope with the reality that comes to you. And so the reason that's interesting, at least to me, and in a relationship to ideology, is because ultimately you start off with borrowed thinking, and that borrowed thinking that you know, like you said, a habitus, it's technically environmental, it's passed on, is your first way of kind of coping with the world. And I guess the best way to put it is that ultimately for Bion, ideology, right, wrong, or indifferent, it's a form of trying to cope with the way reality is. You see this a lot with people who are constantly, let's say, whenever they see something they don't agree with, they call it, you know, propaganda, right? Mm-hmm. Or, you know, things like that, where, well, they'll shoot something down immediately. And for a lot of people, you might call this lazy thinking, but the way I see it is that, you know, it's a very unhealthy way of somebody trying to cope with information, again, true or false, that they don't care for. And so I guess I find it interesting to think of ideology in that way, which is actually kind of how I write, is where when I'm looking at different viewpoints and different ideas, it's not so much about, oh, they think wrong, they don't understand, they don't have all the facts. It's mostly kind of poking at the way they use their theories and ideas to cope with things, as opposed to understanding them.
So this gets into like reversible perspective, right? So Bion talks about this in, I believe, I don't really know. Actually, the book that I have this references in is actually not a Bion book, but is a Mary Jacobus book, The Poetics of Psychoanalysis.
Oh, yeah.
But it really heavily borrows from Bion. And she says that the reversible perspective is a particular and deadly analytic impasse which defends against psychic pain. Basically, what in more common parlance, non-psychoanalytic language, we call cognitive dissonance, and the response to that. And again, in Bion's own words, and I think this is Jacobus quoting him, so I'm going to trust that she's quoting him accurately.
Right.
Is reversible perspective is evidence of pain that the patient reverses perspective so to make the dynamic situation static. So when you have, for example, ideology that is adopted contra other tendencies in one's life, that the reversible perspective is a part of your perspective that you can flip to maintain low cognitive dissonance. And I think this is helpful to think about it. I think Ruth Malcolm writes about this in an article called As If, which is from a book, Clinical Lectures on Klein and Bion from 1982. So classical British psychoanalysis stuff. But it gets stated as the following. Reversible perspective is an extreme case of rigidity of thought. As Bion says, what is most characteristic in such cases is manifest accord and latent discord. Interpretation is accepted, but the premises have been rejected. The actual specificity, the substance of the interpretation is rejected. And this means reversible perspective is a potential destruction and deformation of any knowledge. Now, what's interesting is that sounds a lot like the way people would say people employ ideology. But the thing is, with ideology, again, we haven't defined it here.
Right.
Ideology in the Marxist perspective has both a broader and more limited definition than what we're talking about now. And also when I say Marxist, because in Marx, ideology is something that he uses in the early stuff and brings up a few times later on, but doesn't have a cohesive theory of that he states anywhere explicitly.
Right.
So, so it's interesting. What do you make of this? Like the fact that you have in Bion, you have something interesting here, in that you have both a social or a sociological understanding of psychoanalytic perspective, but it's still paired with the kind of methodologically individualist. And I don't mean that as an insult, by the way. I actually think rejecting methodological individualism in the case of psychology is kind of idiotic.
Yes, right.
But a methodological individualism in looking at how it would manifest in a particular person and the way that their own frameworks might change.
Right. Well, what I make of this is, first off, I think he, the weird thing about Bion is if you read him in chronological order, he sets up the stuff about group dynamics first, and then he kind of reverse engineers that back to the individual, which is interesting because, for example, he rejects the idea of the herd instinct. Basically, as far as he's concerned, like to kind of go with your talk about the sociological perspective with the individual methodology, he kind of melds that and says, look, it's a false dichotomy. I guess the best way to put it is that there is no individual without the group, and there's no group without the individual. And this is actually interesting because I know a lot of people are tired of the idea of authenticity. Even existentialists kind of have they have a hard time kind of talking about that. But I think if this is why I unite Sartre and Bion in this case, is that authenticity in Bion is not an individual thing necessarily. It might involve looking at the individual and trying to create yourself, as Sartre would say, but you never leave the group per se. And so what that does, not to go off on a Sartre rant here, but what that does basically is it takes kind of the individual, and instead of trying to either exclude the individual and have it be only about the group, or only have it be about the individual and exclude the group, which is something Sartre tries to deal with in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, he basically says that humans are groupish animals, which is an interesting way to put it. It's we want to be a part of the group, while at the same time we want to define ourselves, and it's something that he doesn't think that we can reconcile. So while it's not while he thinks it's a false dichotomy between a sociological and an individual kind of methodology, it's also something we can't resolve, which makes it kind of explains the way people are drawn to groups. Actually, it would be kind of interesting to apply it to leftist splintering, because you're drawn to a group and you really enjoy it, but then you start trying to kind of define your individual sort of view of things, and then splinters off into another group. And then it's kind of Sartre's alienation in a sense, except for the fact that that alienation requires the group, which is for me anyways, it's an interesting paradox. And so let's see, to bring it back to reversible perspectives, basically the reversible perspectives is about cognitive dissonance, but I think it kind of goes a little bit deeper in the fact that the individual, as far as Bion's concerned, can't reconcile the individual desire, to define oneself, and the desire to be in a group, which satiates your what he calls basic assumptions, what other people might call instincts. So it kind of how do I put this? It kind of makes a problem in a sense for solidarity, I guess.
In what way? Well, like, in what specific way does this complicate solidarity?
Well, for one thing, it makes it to where it makes it to where solidarity is born of a conflict, as opposed to being a way to overcome conflict, I guess, is the way I see it. And I'm not a Marxist, so maybe Marx has an answer to this. I haven't read enough Marx to know, so he might. But on one hand, it makes solidarity a product of conflict, and it's not a conflict. It doesn't really overcome. It might overcome interpersonal conflicts for a little bit, but it's born of the conflict with the individual, kind of against themselves. They want to be a part of a group, but they want to be individual. But the problem, the reason it complicates solidarity, as far as I'm concerned, is that, at least if you follow Bion's theory further, Bion develops a concept called valency types, where the individual is a certain type, but that certain type kind of is defined by the relationships that you have over time, starting with your mother. You borrow the thinking of your mother, and then you continue on, and you come into contact with your peers, where you have to kind of reconcile the thinking that you borrowed with this other thinking. So you borrow more thinking, or you reflect on it, or you don't. It really depends. But the valency type ultimately becomes a problem for solidarity, because you end up being drawn to the groups that appeal to your valency type, appeal to the way you've developed your basic assumptions, your instincts.
Okay.
But then Bion would say that you're still not ever able to fully integrate into that group, regardless, because once you integrate into that group, you end up kind of you still want to define yourself as an individual, and if you're too much like the rest of the group, then you start to reflect on your you start to do kind of a reversible perspective. It's almost like bad faith, in the sense that it's a constant thing that you can't really get out of. Now, Bion might be wrong, might not be as encompassing as he thinks, but that's kind of where I see the problem with solidarity. It's not that you can't ever have solidarity ever. It's just that you'll develop solidarity, and eventually people will splinter. Okay. Eventually you splinter.
So I guess this leads a whole sort of complicated series here of habitus, defining where you come from, inculcating certain class, and all kinds of actual elements into your worldview. Then you're going to have the ideological development around justifying that, and then you have the way you process cognitive dissonance, which gets us into reversible perspective, which could lead to all kinds of things that show an increasing rigidity of thought, but are also likely to be alienating, to lead to people seeming to flip on a dime as far as like where they actually land ideologically, to be triggered by things that you cannot articulate. So, for example, one of my favorite things to point out is how many leftist men go right wing after a divorce that they didn't pick, like. Reversible perspective there is pretty explanatory. It's like, okay, so you don't want to deal with certain things about your own life and what it says about you. It's easier than to blame an ideological constraint that you put yourself under, and then to flip it. You just invert it.
Right. That's actually interesting that you say that, because so when Bion develops his idea of group dynamics, and this is something a lot of people don't talk about, at least I don't talk to a lot of Bionians, so maybe.
Yeah, so maybe more people talk about it than we realize.
Right.
But Bionians are rare these days too,
Very.
actually. So
Yes, very. But what's interesting when he talks about groups is he says that a group develops two different aspects: the mentality and the culture. For him, culture always comes out of conflict. It requires a sort of problem within a group. Because ultimately what the culture is trying to do is the culture is trying to adapt the group mentality that was used to kind of direct the group. So as I think we've discussed before, groups are either driven by the objective or by the basic assumptions, the instincts or the shared instincts. Although shared instincts is probably not the right word, but the group mentality is what develops in a group when everybody focuses on an objective. So you can see this mildly in maybe older forms of protest where there's something to do, maybe not in the recent where they protest in an empty federal building or something. Not quite like that, but like if a group has a specific objective, if there's something to do, you develop a group mentality. And that group mentality would be it would be almost a simplistic version of an ideology, or maybe ideology is not the right word, but a shared philosophy. Let's say a shared philosophy for a group. That's group mentality. But as we noted, the individual gets, discontent with the group, whether it's, they got divorced and they're trying to cope with it. If we follow Bion, every thought is an attempt to cope with reality. And so when the mentality no longer serves the purpose, a culture develops because there's conflict within the group. And it's basically what the culture does, the setup of the development of a culture. You could apply this actually to culture wars. Is the culture, the development of culture is an attempt to pick a new basic assumption or stick with the old one. Because for Bion, there's three. There's fight or flight, dependency, and parity, which basically is, fighting, Messiah, and sex, at least as far as Bion's concerned. One could say that pairing has more aspects to it, but overall, actually, one might say love instead of sex to bring it to kind of a group idea. But basically, when a group has a certain group mentality, there's a basic assumption that everybody agrees on, almost in a spontaneous manner. It's just something that has to be done or has to be assumed to do an objective, to complete an objective. So the people who stormed the Bastille pretty much have the same kind of basic assumption. They're storming the Bastille. You're going to have to fight or flight. That's basically what that is. But when that group, and that's not a good example of an ongoing group, but if that group's basic assumption either doesn't serve the goal or doesn't serve the people within the group, a culture brews. Because the culture, a cultural aspect is how one decides what the next basic assumption is, although a lot of people want to put it in those terms. And so you kind of notice this with the culture wars, because there's a lot of dissidents in America right now. Not that there hasn't been for a long time, but it's growing. And so the culture wars was, as far as I understood it, was a way for trying to pick, okay, are we confronting things? Do we need a leader? Or are we, is this about love? And so far it seems, for example, on the left, there's a major tendency to go towards dependency. Not always, but at least recently, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
Yeah, and so and the right tends to be more about just confronting shit. They just they're all about attacking minorities. They're kind of going off the rails. Now this hasn't always been the case. Obviously moods change and things like that. But ultimately, that tends to be what a culture is about. The development of a group culture. And so this is where, kind of to bring it back to solidarity kind of requires that group mentality that, as far as Bion's concerned, is not entirely something that you can maintain forever.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that leads us into a kind of cul-de-sac, because the creation of group solidarity, at least in this influence on the psychological level, would fragment over time unless you had, particularly if it's aspirational or procreative or something, as opposed to defensive. The defensive thinker will, the conservative thinker, the reactionary thinker, actually would have an advantage in this regard, because there's something concrete they're holding on to that's going to be less likely to fragment. And any reversible perspective might even actually help them, because they're still holding on to the same basic fragment. Other elements of their ideology can completely change, which is why you might see wild shifts from like libertarianism to national conservatism or something, which are ideologically incoherent and can't exist in the same person, yet someone can hold on to defending the same status quo and have changed those elements of their ideology.
Right. Well, yeah, this is like when people talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene. I don't know if I sometimes I mix up the Taylor and the Greene, but
yes, Marjorie Taylor Greene, you're correct.
Okay. This is like when people go, "Oh, she's to the left of the squad," when she makes certain statements. It's like, well, she's not. It's a reversible perspective. Basically, she's not. What was it recently that she was talking about? It was I want to say it was Russia. It had to have been Russia. And she's talking about how, the squad, was okay with funding, Ukraine instead of I want to say instead of keeping the money domestic, basically, they were okay with sending it to Ukraine. And a lot of people go, "Oh, she's to the left of." It's like, well, no, she's not to the left.
That's instrumentalized logic. Like, she would have sent the money too, probably. Like, that's the
right. Yeah, she would have sent it to Russia or
maybe even Ukraine if it wasn't under a Democratic president where this policy
exactly. And so that's kind of, reversible perspective is how I kind of look at politics generally. Like, I should say spectacle politics. It's kind of the stuff where people are engaged but not really thinking about it. It's just the way I used to describe it is it seems like every 48 years people just kind of switch talking points. If the conservatives do whatever, the liberals are not okay with it. But if the liberals do the same thing in about 8 years, there's all sorts of justification.
Yeah, we see this easily, for example, in the conservative abandonment of federalism and the liberals picking up federalism as a response to the Supreme Court or whatever. Like, it's a very instrumentalized reason, because, everyone has a part to play. There's also the whole blaming the electorate thing that Democrats like to do, but what they're blaming them for often moves around. So, for example, now we're blaming people for the SCOTUS victory because people didn't vote for Hillary Rodham Clinton in 2016, even though even from objectively speaking, there was no way the Democrats were going to take the Senate then. And if Hillary Clinton had taken the presidency, the prior historical patterns were that the Democrats would have lost in 2018, not won. So there's no way that they would have gotten a Supreme Court justice through. And so it would have been just it would have been like 4-3-1 as opposed to 5 or 6-3 or whatever it would be. And so, I bring this up because, again, that's a perspective shift where stuff is shifting so that people don't have to deal with the pain, actually, that realizing that your politicians don't really believe shit, and that your identity attached to that is actually very flimsy, would it lead to?
Right.
And for me, Bion actually gets to something that I warn people. If you think your political morality is your identity and is your moral identity, what you're going to find is you don't have a moral identity,
Right.
because the politics are usually subject to reversible perspective changes or cognitive dissonance changes, and people will say they're maintaining the same values and yet reverse course. Another example is the way Democrats stood on tariffs traditionally till 2016, and that's one of the only things where this whole thesis of realignment was actually in place during Trump, because that was one of the Republican policy points that did actually shift was
Right.
on tariffs. So it's stuff like that. And I think people think when they're like, aha, I'm calling you out for being a hypocrite. It doesn't matter. Like the hypocrisy is not like, that's not why people are doing things. This is not a logical, like Bion's inclinations, and why I mentioned instrumental rationality, which is a sociological and philosophical concept, more than an analytic one, but one that I think is useful when approaching Bion here, because you can start seeing how people's ideological rationale is partly about maintaining a group identity and set by group habitats, but it's also partly about differentiating yourself from a group.
Right.
And so those things are in tension and lead to incoherent politics that aren't rational. And I think this gets us into another element of Bion that I found fascinating, that I didn't know until I started this series on him with you.
Right.
And that was his stuff on there's a couple of things that come up in mind of that, which is alpha elements, beta elements, and alpha function in thinking. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay. All right. So basically, let's start with beta elements, because that's basically the bottom. That's just sensory datum to keep it simple.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the alpha element, which is I want to make sure I get this correct, because I know the alpha function is thinking. It's the actual thinking apparatus that when you're born you borrow from your parents, and that you develop over time. And if you follow Bionian psychoanalysis, you're supposed to, kind of go back and rework every now and then.
Yeah, the A function is undigested and unconceptualized facts, impressions, sensations that you have as an individual that cannot be mentalized in course of your beta elements, which I guess beta elements, for those who really want to kind of understand it, it's projective identification, it's habitus, it's stuff like religious identity even. Right. And so the alpha function is when you have to take those alpha elements that I was talking about, which is going to be like impressions, sense data, undigested and unconceptualized facts, and try to put them in the beta element framework.
Right. Yes.
Okay,
so I mixed those up a little bit. So.
Yeah. And he thinks this leads to all kinds of weird shit, like bizarre objects and like
yes.
Right. But I guess I can read this, and this is from. Let me see what this is. This is from. This is from Bion 1962. Okay. Beta elements are not amenable to use in dream thoughts, but are suited for use in projective identification. They are influential in producing acting out. They are the objects that can be evacuated or used for a kind of thinking that depends on manipulation of what are felt to be things in themselves. And we have to get into his stuff about
his Kantian,
weirdness. as if it is a substitute for such manipulations for words or ideas. Alpha functions transform sense impressions into alpha elements, which resemble and in many facts may be identical with the visual images which we are familiar in dreams, namely the dream elements regards to yielding their latent content when their analyst has interpreted them. The failure of alpha function means that the patient cannot dream and therefore cannot sleep. And as alpha function makes sense impressions of the emotional experience available for consciousness in dreams, thoughts the patients cannot dream, cannot go to sleep, and cannot wake up. Okay, so thinking here is complicated. So let's talk about like this, because I wanted to read that because I realized that even I'm kind of misstating what it is. The alpha function is the thought, is like almost an effective thought apparatus that comes out of things you can't conceptualize, but isn't out of your quote beta elements, which is all this habitat stuff that's already there. That is also not I like the subconscious as opposed to unconscious for reasons that you do too, as your Sartrean, and because I'm like, I don't think anyone's ever acting totally unconsciously, but I do think they're not acting actively consciously. Right. That's a slightly different thing. So these alpha functions will show up in dreams and whatnot, but this low-level habitat stuff is going to more show up in your ideological construction around it, I think. And so
it's kind of hard because to kind of bring the truth.
Yeah, and I will tell you what book that's from. I think it's from Bion's A Theory of Thinking, which is reprinted in Bion's book Second Thoughts.
Right.
But it's not clear to me. I did a lot of research for this interview, and I'm still like, I don't know if I understand all this. Well, actually,
I was gonna say, so you see, this is why I bring Sartre in. Also, when I talk to people about Bion, because there have been a few people who've been interested, I always tell them, like, listen, Bion does two things that are going to make everything else really weird, and it makes his memoir thing at the end, his last book, just kind of crazy. He goes into kind of this Kantian style thing in itself, and he goes into this mystical sort of direction, which is why I have Sartre, because Sartre as a person may not have been the most attached to reality, but his theories seem to be. And so that's why I have to bring Sartre in to kind of temper this a little bit.
I was reading the Psychoanalytic Aesthetics, the British School by Nicola Glover, and that's when I started getting confused. And we do have to talk about this Kantian stuff, because that's when I was like trying to understand what he meant by bizarre objects that emerge from the tensions between beta elements and alpha elements, and which sounds like fetish stuff. I mean, and in the psychoanalytical sense, but it's a more encompassing concept than that. Right. And also it sounds like Lacanian crap. Lacanian theories about petit object and all the Lacanian object, almost object fixation theories. So what's interesting is like this pulls on object relations theory. And object relations theory is like big in psychoanalysis, particularly in attachment theory, but is not commonly studied by leftists because it's not out of Freud or the Germans, nor is it out of the French. It comes out of Klein, Winnicott, Gunthrop, and to a lesser degree, Bion. And so, like, object relations theory, I think in America, if you study it, it might be called British object relations theory and psychoanalysis or something.
I think so.
It is part of what he's pulling on. And that does go back to Freud. I mean, Freud identified the subject's environment with the term object. So they like the object Oz, like the environmental impulse, which is the object of one's drives, like why you do something based off of your home environment. But Fairbarn, I think that's how you say that name.
That's how I say it. I say Fairbarn.
Fairbarn really like posited that it wasn't just drive satisfaction that was going on in this object relations theory, but the satisfaction of being in relation to real others, which is an interesting thing because that moves Freud back into the phenomenological conception that you see in Hegel, actually, because like. Right. The reason why the master-slave dialectic is so important is that in that conflict, you actually realize you are a separate being from the other, and you, which is part of. So it's interesting because this is something you can deduce from Hegel. You can deduce it from many theories, actually. But the idea that the individual conceptually is only even meaningful in the context of some kind of aggregate or collective experience. Of which one is both identifying with and simultaneously distancing from to feel like they have a separate concrete identity. For people who don't know terror management theory and American psychoanalysis, actually, I think terror management's also used in cognitive behavioral theory too. That's what they're talking about there is like this tendency to identify with and also move away from, because in identifying with, you are showing a continuity, but in moving away from, you are defining your individuality and thus confirming your own existence.
Right.
Thus projecting that existence into the future.
Yeah, I was going to say, that you also see that in Sartre, although Sartre definitely, he views it a little differently. He takes the master-slave relationship and he turns it into a sadomasochism relationship.
Right.
And which maybe not the difference for him, because he did pull on Hegel a lot. A lot of people think that the title being Nothingness is a play on Heidegger, but it's actually played on Hegel. But
yeah, and Critique of Dialectical Reasoning is also, I mean, the whole book is a Sartrean engagement with Hegel. And what's interesting is how much of Hegelian dialectic Sartre may reject. The initial subject-object conflict is something he accepts.
Right.
So
a lot of times the way I explain existentialism to people, just to try to be quick about it, is I say that, at least for Sartre, this may not apply for other existentialists, but for Sartre, he has a dialectic that has no synthesis. And I know technically the synthesis or the thesis antithesis synthesis thing is a little simplistic,
right? But it's more Kantian and Fichte than it is Hegel, but yes,
right. Yeah, and so he just kind of, the thing with Sartre is he always rejects. It's kind of similar with Bion in a different setup, but Sartre always rejects any synthesis. He says, "Oh, you're at odds with the other person," and basically he says, "Okay, the sadomasochistic relationship changes. You might be the sadist, you might be the masochist, but it's going to change. And there's no equilibrium. There's no point where you meet somebody and go, oh, you're a pretty cool person, I guess." Mm-hmm. It's always conflict. And I guess the thing about Bion, I guess the difference for Bion, which ends up sort of being the same in group dynamics, is the difference between the like the individual needs the group, but the group needs the individual kind of thing, is that he kind of packages that all within the individual. That's why he calls us a groupish animal.
Which is why he's doing social psychology and not sociology.
Right, exactly. And it's kind of, I know for a fact, I actually find it irritating. A lot of people who write about Bion write about his biography. And I get it. Somebody thinks he's an amazing guy. But I'm trying to learn things. But basically, it seems like his entire psychoanalytical system is an attempt to deal with his experiences in war, which is fine. It's not a bad thing. But it's kind of like with Sartre and the notion of freedom, where freedom becomes so extreme, like it's to the extremities of you're being tortured, but you're allowing it, kind of thing. Kind of goes to Bion in the sense that for him, the individual is just they can join a group. It's a weird kind of circle. I'm going to try to explain it as best I can. But you have a valency type, which drives you towards a certain group. While you're in that group,
and that valency type is set by all kinds of conditions, both social and personal, that are beyond your control.
Right, and Bion would argue that it's like set in place by your parents, but it gets molded slowly but surely over time. It gets molded as a byproduct of what you do, not because of what you do.
Got it.
As well as social.
Which is a subtle distinction, but not one without import.
Yeah. I was gonna say it's kind of like when Sartre throws that in there a little bit later on, and he's like, yeah, you can be affected by things not because you did. It's like, okay, but with Bion, your valency type determines which kind of group you go to. You go to that group and you kind of figure out how the group mentality works because you take to it instinctually. But then you start to realize that everybody is thinking that way. And so all of a sudden you decide to define your individuality, what Sartre would call authenticity, which allows for you to kind of put your basic assumption in review, your valency type. And it doesn't mean you necessarily escape it, but you might change it a little bit. You might move it in a certain direction. Maybe you join, for a real life example, maybe you join a really militant kind of Trotskyist group because you're just mad.
Right.
And then after a while, you're like, this is kind of exhausting. I'm tired of being mad all the time. And so you switch up, your basic assumption to, I don't know,
being a democratic socialist. And
yeah,
you switch that up from being just a fucking Democrat, and then by the time you're 70s, you're a goddamn Republican.
Right, pretty much. Right, exactly. And it can go the other way too. Like, I know you know about this, but like,
I am the example the other way.
Yes. I was gonna say, I was a conservative when I was in high school, a conservative Christian, believe it or not. And so now I'm here.
Yeah, that I wasn't. So
I grew up with this, Methodist family in Missouri. We were one banjo away from being a comedy trope, and don't
knock the banjo, my friend. No. The banjo did nothing to you or your family. No, go ahead.
But
that is your late. What is it? What does Bion call it? Your
valency type.
Your valency type.
Yeah.
And this is your own reversible perspective in regards to the banjo.
Bion would say that I like Sartre so much because this is what I'm running away from.
Right. Exactly.
But,
I think there's a sense in which my fuck you-ness to conservative thinking is actually an anxiety of influence, to use another psychoanalytic literary theory, where I have to deal with the fact that was the world that I came from, and thus to make my own differences more known, sometimes I feel like I'm actually overstating ways in which I'm not a nationalist. But that's because I was one. And so like the differentiation has, and I think I'm psychoanalytically or psychologically, maybe even more accurate here, aware of my own patterns and discourse patterns and this and the other, to know that some of this is a very personal overcorrection. That fits the patterns of reversible perspective. So one thing I think people should realize is, just because you understand how this shit works doesn't mean you're still not going to do it. And it might be helpful to yourself to know that you're doing it, but you're still going to do it even if you don't know that you're doing it. Like you're going to do it either way.
Right. And this is why Gasp, my writing is sometimes called cynical, because Bion doesn't necessarily give you a way out. There isn't a basic assumption that's good. There's a basic, he draws on a concept that Winnicott develops later called the good enough mother. But he kind of applies a version of that to basic assumptions, where he's saying, the point is not to avoid these basic assumptions, it's to be good enough. It's to use it as a way to cope, but maybe don't go all in. But, again, he doesn't necessarily give you a way out, because, you might be tired of fighting. And like I've seen people go from fighting, fight or flight, to pairing, where, they pretend like they don't care about anything in the world. And it's like, I remember you, yelling at me over nothing. I was there. I know. But it's interesting that Bion doesn't give you a way out. Unfortunately, I'm drawn to those kind of theories. I don't know what that says about my valency type, but this is why sometimes I'll talk to people, and there's that, I would call it a conservative idea. John Gray talks about it, the cycle of history or whatever, where he says things kind of repeat themselves. And for me, I don't, I kind of go with Voltaire, where Voltaire said that history doesn't repeat itself, people do. But for me, it's more our moods. I guess moods is not the right word. Our basic assumptions kind of repeat themselves. And, so it's, and now they repeat themselves in different material conditions, so they look different. For example, if you, to take Christopher Hitchens, because I did see your talk with Ben Burgess, he starts out as a Trotskyist, kind of railing against, Washington and Moscow.
Yeah, he starts out as a Cliffite Trotskyist in particular, which is important, because there's a spectrum of this is something not understood by even a lot of the MLs today. There's a spectrum of response to the Soviet Union. One is Sam Marcy and the Marcyite Trots, who were more defensive of the Soviet Union even under Stalin than Khrushchev was, and they remained Trotskyist. What's interesting is those parties over time in the States, not in Europe, became more and more anti-revisionist, and then eventually just became Marxist-Leninist parties, even though their origins, if you look them up, were Trotskyist. Then there are Deutscher and Mandelite defensist. Then there were kind of Grantite and Spartacist League Orthodox Trots, and those are different in the Orthodoxy too, which is confusing. Right. And then there was the spectrum of Trots that picked up left communist or Marxist humanist standpoints about state capitalism, and that was what the Cliffites represented. So the reason why that's important in the case of someone like Hitchens is it means that he is trying to distance himself from the Soviet Union even when he's a Marxist. Right. And for some reasons that are good, for some reasons that by the time they're doing it aren't necessarily true, because it's like, well, by the time you get to the 70s, even though Andropov and Beria were not particularly, had kind of fallen slightly back into the Marxist-Leninist Stalin orbit a little bit, no one had like repudiated the Khrushchev secret speech or anything. It wasn't like even the USSR had gone back and adopted all like Stalin was super great, awesome, forever and ever. Mm-hmm. And so the distinction seems weird because it comes out of a very particular context. Now, I say that all because I think you're still right about where that puts Hitchens. I mean, one of the things about that I got pushback on the Hitchens interview with Burgess was that people thought we didn't go into the actual content of Hitchens' thought that much. And I'm like, well, it's because there's in the Burgess book, the context is mostly sympathetic, but there's no like the explorations of the fractures that emerge early on that are already there. I think even in early Hitchens is not the purpose of Burgess's book, and he doesn't do it.
Yes.
right? So if you want me to do that,
Right.
I actually have to make a different argument than what Burgess is arguing, or I have to try to mirror the book. And I think the book is kind of, I mean, it's interesting enough. I don't want to like dog it, but I don't think I did not learn much about Christopher Hitchens from it, but I am assuming that it wasn't written for me.
I don't want to go into it.
I know you should not go into it. You will
yes.
already burn more bridges. You've already burned bridges here. But
yes, right. Yeah.
But what's your point about Hitchens though? I think
Well,
I think
my point was to kind of just to demonstrate how basic assumptions we cycle through them.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, there's no cycle of history. History, I won't even say it goes straight forward or anything. It just goes in progress. I kind of lean on Sartre for this. It kind of goes in progressions and regressions, and it really depends on the material conditions and what's going on. But the thing that seems to constantly happen over and over again is the basic assumptions and the way we approach things. For example, the reason I was going to use Hitchens is it seems like Hitchens starts out kind of fight or flight type of basic assumption. And then he moves to his, what I would consider, he's kind of more of a literary critic. He still goes after like, Bill Clinton and whatnot. But
yeah, I mean, you have this literary critic phase, but it's very critical of new Atari Democrats and New Labor.
Right.
But it's also increasingly not super political. And then you have the third phase, which is the new atheist phase, where the urgency of the beginning is instead of being pitched at, I don't know, capitalism, is now being pitched at religion as a concept,
Right.
and thus a certain amount of permanent revolution or whatever is a permanent bourgeois revolution. Actually, would be would be the view here. Is necessary to disentangle that, and it's interesting because in God Is Not Great, Hitchens actually attacks his Trotskyist self for being too religious.
Right.
Which is he's almost unique actually in the Four Horsemen of New Atheism in attacking political ideologies as proxies for religion. Everybody else doesn't go there.
Right.
And I find that interesting because it is to me like a reversible perspective problem. But the orientation, the crisis orientation and the defense of some kind of notion of progress hasn't changed the entire time.
Yes. Right. And that's the interesting thing about the Valency type, and Bion doesn't quite go into this. But as far as I can understand, I feel like the Valency type changes, but it doesn't quite change. It's hard to explain. I don't want to say that Bion says that the subject doesn't change. I know Sartre argues that people don't usually change voluntarily, but that's a whole thing we can talk about later. But for Bion, the Valency type, like you were saying, that kind of the idea of progress for Hitchens never changes. And it kind of seems that it's, the Valency type sort of changes in the sense that it picks a different basic assumption, but it doesn't, at least we should say the unhealthy sort, doesn't change. It uses reversible perspective, and it picks through, different basic assumptions. And that tends to be how people work. Look at right now with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. We went from like 2 days on Twitter of everybody basically screaming to people saying AOC 2024. We jumped from, fight or flight to dependency real fucking quick. And it's almost like, at least, I don't want to say the left in America, because I don't, we don't have left organizations, but we have leftists. And it seems like leftists are kind of centered around this dependency. Now, that's not quite a good analogy because I'm using a group instead of an individual where the valency type makes more sense. But yeah, it's the valency type seems not to change unless you go through the kind of psychoanalytic, let's call it therapy, that Bion would suggest to be able to actually access that valency type and to review it, so to speak.
Right. So you basically have to some way make your habitus, your inclinations, and all these things that Bion, being a mid-century psychoanalytic, would have been more mostly products of the environment. I think now we have to assume it's a complex of things, including environmental triggers on genetics and the environment, genetic predispositions,
Right.
class variances, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think Bion's interesting in comparison even to Lacan or somebody more associated with psychoanalysts on the left, in that Bion presupposes group affect and affect pretty strongly in ways that are not generally dealt with in psychoanalysis that isn't Marxist explicit, like
Right.
Marxist psychoanalysis hybrid thought, like Frankfurt School or any number of Lacanian psychoanalysis and Badiou. I mean, like people have severely not dealt with the fact that, like, basically most left theory has mid-century psychoanalytic assumptions, but they're mostly French.
Yes.
Because of basically scholarship fads, if I'm completely honest.
Right.
Because Lacan is easy to use in term papers because it's vague.
Right.
I mean, which is a dick move to say. It's not to say that there's nothing there. Because I actually have developed an appreciation of elements of Lacan, but I've not found where, like, people have convinced me it's inherently radical or even all that clinically useful. Like,
right. Well, so I was gonna say, because I have brought up Bion to, I know, maybe 2 Lacanians, so I guess it's not a very good test group, but I brought up Bion to them, and it seems that the biggest difference in approach for a Lacanian versus a Bionian is the dependency on theory.
Okay.
Because Bion ultimately calls this, and this is where I kind of get my non-theoretical, I don't do a lot of theory, if at all. But this is what Bion calls the intense beam of darkness, where he argues that the point, like, an analyst is supposed to approach a patient, or if you were to extend this to social theory, a social system or a group of people, and you're supposed to he says you're supposed to deny or reject memory and desire. You're supposed to not associate that group with what you personally think. You're also not supposed to associate that group with like past situations you've been in. Okay. Which one of the things
that's real hard to do.
It's incredibly difficult, and I would say it's almost impossible. Because ultimately, humans, as far as I'm concerned, are pattern-seeking creatures. And so if I see something and it fits a pattern, it's very hard to tell myself, don't worry about the pattern, just let it play out. It's very hard to do. This is why I think Bion eventually ends up going towards mystics, because I think mystics are the only people who convince themselves that they can do that. And I think he was convinced that that's what you have to do.
Yeah, so I guess this is a good place to turn, because this mystical turn is this stuff around. I guess we didn't go into the bizarre objects, which I do think we need to talk a little bit about. But if you're capable of that. But then it gets into this ineffable thing, which is where Bion completely loses me. And I feel like I've gone into, like, Kantian mysticism. Or object-oriented ontology or something like. It's like so bizarre.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting, but it's also infuriating.
Right.
Because, for example, I firmly believe that people are not geared towards truth. It's not that we can't find it or discern it. It's that we don't care about it unless it's useful.
I mean, I think Nietzsche's observation in Truth and Lies in a non-moral sense actually has been vindicated by psychology.
Right. Right.
It's like we don't really give a shit about truth unless it's useful to us.
Right. Exactly.
We're all secretly dirty pragmatists, even though we lie about it.
Right. Yeah. It's like I had somebody tell me one time that I didn't know what I was talking about, and they're like, "Well, I'm a truth seeker," and it's like, truth seekers are just people running away from some things they don't like. You're not seeking anything; you're running away from the truth. But so Bion gets to this point where he starts saying that humans are somehow automatically geared towards truth, or need the truth. It depends on what you read, or at least for me, it seems, because there's some times where he states almost unequivocally that we need the truth. Mm-hmm. And there's other times where he says, well, we need the truth for mental growth, which is a bit more pragmatic. It's saying that you need to face the truth every now and then, which I think is fair. People do need to face the truth every now and then. And so, but the part that infuriates me is that eventually he starts saying that we need the truth, but then he says the truth is unknowable. It's the Kantian thing in itself. And it's like, okay, if we need it, but we can't get to it, what do you expect us to do?
Right. And, well, this again reminds me of Lacan, like jouissance, and the fact that you literally can't have your desire met. That won't, is an impossibility. And so I'm just like, well, what's the point then?
Yeah, exactly. And for me, you could kind of take the whole concept of truth and Bion and the mystical thing that follows. You could cut that out, which is what I do. I kind of ignore it, and it's not because it's necessarily evil. It's just useless. It doesn't tell you anything. And I personally think that we can access truth. I just don't think we like to do it a lot. We just, it hasn't been very helpful to us. Illusion's more helpful usually. And so I think you can actually reverse engineer here from his concept of truth and his mystical ideas to the bizarre objects that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't remember exactly what he says about bizarre objects. I want to, I'm aware of it, but unfortunately, like the truth stuff, I kick a lot of stuff out sometimes because it's.
Yeah, so let's go into this a little bit. I can help you on this one. So, this, I think, is really picked up by the thinker Roger Capper in A Mind of One's Own, but he's really basing it, again, off Bion lectures. And in the lectures, bizarre objects are external objects which, by way of projective identification, are given characteristics of the subject's personality. So, it's displacement.
That's right. Yes. Right.
It's almost a displacement fetish.
Yeah.
So they form from part of the Bion's view on object relations theory, that psychotic attacks on attacks on the normal linking between objects are produced by this kind of fracturing and these bizarre objects,
I remember,
and thus produce a fractured world. And so the patient tells themselves they're surrounded by hostile, bizarre objects, instead of and this explains things like, from Bion's perspective, for example, conspiracy thinking is a bizarre object that is a byproduct of not being able to put the system together as a whole. So you identify personality traits and intentions to individual elements in the system and thus extrapolate that it must be a person.
Right.
And so like that's the way this would function in a normal person, in a quote normal person's thinking. And in a psychotic's thinking, it's literal, like they think objects have personalities and shit. But the other thing is the objects start operating as superego displacements, and this is where it gets weird. So they blur the boundary between the internal and external regulatory functions for Bion. And when this happens, people might they might impose a kind of externalized moralism on someone who they're victimizing, because their internal external walls are kind of breaking down.
So the best way I understand this is, and this is not how Bion meant it, because Bion is in the end a fan of religion to a certain extent.
Right, he thinks religion serves some kind of psychic function, but
right.
Like, I mean, and it's interesting because in Bion's examples of bizarre objects, his examples are literal. So, like a man who feels watched by the telephone because he feels paranoid and it's manifesting in the telephone, or someone feeling like the music player is listening back to them.
Yes.
But that's the extremophile examples is using to kind of show it an operation in normal, in quote, normal.
Right, right. And so my understanding of bizarre objects actually kind of relates to Sartre, it like in the way that, you know, the less extreme way. It kind of relates to Sartre's idea of relics, because Sartre argues that the reason that we have relics and the reason we have, say, museums, for example, is because we believe, illusory or not, that when, you know, Mark Twain's favorite pen is Mark Twain's pen, and we believe that we have to keep that with the rest of his stuff because those objects in one way or another contain or have the residue of his being, which is why we have museums. We have things from famous people, and we say, well, this is Van Gogh's painting. Technically, it's just a painting, and Sartre points that out. He says that this is how religion works, which is what I was going to bring up with Bion. I think Bion describes the tendency towards religion, at least in the crude sense of religion, and the idea of relics and idols and things like that, where basically religious doctrines to some extent will teach you kind of that, you know, it's God's will. So all of a sudden anything internal, any sort of kind of internal moral ideas are irrelevant. And, you know, so you project morality onto objects. You have the idols, you have the crucifix, you have things like that. And what he was talking about the moralism of our victims is kind of the missionary style of we're saving the savages as they're wiping out people and doing horrible, terrible things. It's kind of a psychological explanation of what John Gray calls, the ethics of convenience, where we're only ethical as long as it's convenient. But Bion would argue that that actually what we do is we kind of take whatever moral system we're supposed to have and we pretend that it's outside of us and it belongs to objects and people and the world. You know, God works in mysterious ways and God forgives the sinner so we can go around and do whatever it is we're doing. So that's how I understood it. I know that's not how he meant it, but I think it's useful in that context. I mean, hell, you kind of see it with politics sometimes, not always, but you definitely saw it with Trump. I mean, you have the whole flag. Like, I'll give you an example. There's a member of my family who's a big Trump supporter, and she has the shirt that has 45 on it for Trump, and she's got the flags and the hat, and just it's a whole outfit, which is weird. Hell, you could probably apply this to the Nazis too. But essentially, it becomes bizarre objects, not in the sense that these objects are hostile to you, but they have meaning that you would otherwise give to yourself or maybe your own experiences.
Yeah, so the core would be the level of projective identification that you're putting in an object, or like if you like, I think about this also in like punk fashion with teenagers and differentiating themselves. That the uniform is essentially arbitrary, but the uniform and seems to express your individuality, where what it actually is doing is expressing both projective identification and group belonging, while also projecting your difference from a different group.
Right, and it that's where Bion is helpful with the concept of authenticity, because for Bion puts a cap. Well, theoretically, if you applied it this way, which he doesn't, but he would put a cap on authenticity, because there's a certain point where authenticity becomes this complete externalization of everything, where the only way to be authentic is to express it. Hell, I mean, I guess you could consider Twitter this way too, actually, but or most social media platforms. But authenticity becomes this externalization where I have to wear the hat that reveals the most about myself. I have to dress a certain way. I have to have these certain opinions, and it's a weird reversal, because you're trying to be yourself, but you enslave yourself to certain objects that are meant to express this self that ultimately control you, which is interesting because Sartre doesn't consider that, even though that would fit into his theory, because, you know, for him, you know, that's a form of objectification, although it's not quite the way he thought. So it's kind of interesting, you know, authenticity. We could put it this way, if we want to put it kind of, I don't want to say in Marxist terms because I don't know enough about Marx, but authenticity under capitalism becomes a bizarre object, or a set of bizarre objects, where you're convinced that you need to consume, you need to have these objects, you need to have these products, and all of a sudden that's what defines your personality. And, you know, it's a way of kind of being inducted into a consumer society.
Okay, so that leads us to this last question that I want to talk about, and this is that ineffable stuff, or the O. So there's the K for knowledge, K negative for like reversible perspective, or negative K for reversible perspective and damage to knowledge, and then there's O. Now, aside from the psychoanalytic mid-century tendency to use equations in weird ways, O is the part that I have the most trouble dealing with, because he talks about negative capability from art, actually, like from John Keats, the ability to kind of have memory and desire be in conflict, and he describes, I mean, Bion talks about this in ways that I don't understand, so I'm just going to use the language he talks about it. He talks about desire and memory that's functioning as non-sensuous. All right, so because of this negative capability, in fact, in the 65 book on transformations, he starts talking about the non-sensuous as the unknowable or ultimate truth, or the thing in itself as separated from the thing, you know, the thing for itself, or the thing, which again is confusing because these Hegelian distinctions are different than the Marxist distinctions of for and in themselves, because we actually mean them differently. But so the thing in itself is completely sui generisly unique. And somehow that gets to this, what does he talk about it as? According to Jacobus, anyway, how do I put this? In aesthetics, Bion has described as a neo-Kantian, for whom reality, or the thing in itself, aka O, the ineffable, in his equation of K and negative K, uh, cannot be known. It can only be beed, meaning that you can be it and you can experience it as being it, but it is It is not just rationally, but totally inarticulable in a way that is constructive of knowledge, even through describing it in sensory channels, meaning that it's not like the quanta qualia distinction either. Like it's
Right,
not
yeah.
that.
Right.
So you have to desist from fact and reason to approach this, and knowledge. Bion starts talking about transformations as an evolution about what happens when K, unaffected by minus K, which is reversible perspective or other rigidities of thought, tries to touch being O, that it causes a response that is both awesome in the traditional sense, like awe-inspiring, but also scary as fuck, and turbulent, and leads to a breakdown of narrative security and thus terror management, which is not a word he uses, but it's the same description, creeps in. But what I can't he calls it the intense catastrophic emotional explosion of or of the object, the external reality of the being in itself. I got no fucking idea what that is.
Yeah, I know, I understand the confusion exactly, because how do I approach this? So one thing that I say is similar about Bion and Lacan, when I explain this to people, and I think I don't know anything about Lacan, but I'll say that it's probably a detriment to both, is that their psychology becomes very much about truth, and it almost becomes metaphysical at one point.
Mm-hmm.
And so for Bion, basically, this is why I pointed out that in his theory without this, there's no way out. It's a constant jumping from basic assumption to basic assumption sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a truth, like he does, an O, something that can't be known except for non-sensuously, then that's a way out, because technically it becomes this sort of touchstone for change. Now, if he had said that this is about, say, self-knowledge, that you get to the ultimate truth of yourself, maybe. Although he would have to admit that you could actually know that. Not saying that you can know that self-knowledge is possible, but within his theory, he would have to admit that if O was self-knowledge. But it's not. It's knowledge of reality. And so the way I understand it is, the way I try to understand it, because God, for one thing, it's kind of God. It's sort of the completion of his mystical turn, where he's set up a truth that is true for everything all the time, but can't be known. It's a basic religious document or dogma.
Mm-hmm.
But it also functions as a way to give the valency type almost a teleological point, because this is where I point out he goes from saying that we need to face the truth every now and then to we want the truth. And so all of a sudden, the Bionian subject goes from dealing with your basic assumptions, trying to understand your valency type, and trying to relate to the world, to being all about relating to the truth. A truth that you can't really relate to, because every time you try to relate to it, it changes you. That's basically how I can understand it without having to accept certain premises that don't make any sense. Because, like, for example, he says to get rid of reason, and I think he's taking his position on the analyst having no theory when dealing with a patient. I think he's taking it to an extreme, where to get to the truth is the same as to get to the patient, which is to have no memory and no desire and just approach it. But the problem is anybody who lives in the world, knows that you can't, that doesn't make any sense, because if there is a truth, as far as I'm concerned, it's probably got a pattern. It seems like it anyway. But ultimately, I think that the truth for him actually functions as an ultimate illusion, because you were talking about how he talks about the breakdown of narratives, and I think that's what his O is there for, is not really to have any actual function, even if he thinks it has a metaphysical or mystical usefulness. I think it's kind of like, it's the ultimate narrative you don't question, because otherwise, if you question it, you kind of get into the postmodern condition where all the meta narratives don't make any sense, and you're trying to grapple with that. So that's what O, I think, is for him, because if you take O out, and then it's a version, it's a psychoanalysis that actually fits pretty well into the postmodern era. You can't accept your basic assumptions. You're, as I've already explained. But if you leave O in, then you kind of move beyond that kind of constant issue with the group and issue with yourself, and culture as a fight against mentality and things like that. And so that's kind of how I think it functions. That's how I understand it anyway.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it off. We've been talking for about an hour and a half. Would you be interested in coming back in a couple of weeks to talk about cynicism? These are going to be, for those of you who are watching and are wondering if these are pre-recorded, yes, they are. So they'll probably both be recorded before they're readily available. But we've been having some back and forth about the definition of cynicism, its classical orientation, etc.
Yeah, right.
And certain attempts to decouple modern cynicism from ancient cynicism, and what the differences might be, and and that actually is like my expertise in ancient philosophy, specifically cynicism and stoicism.
Right. I'll be a bit of an amateur, I guess. Depends on who you talk to, but I might have some expertise in modern cynicism.
Yeah, you are often called a cynic.
Yeah.
So we'll probably talk about that. I'll send you some dates, but I hope people have learned something from this. I would say find some Bion and try to read it. It's not as hard as Lacan, but it is harder than some things, because it takes a little while to get into the vocabulary and the symbolic representation stuff that Bion's doing.
The group dynamics is kind of easy. But then when he starts going into the individual, it gets a little bit harder.
Yeah, by the time you get into like the treatises on thinking or the transformations book, oh my god, his last book's like a memoir from the future. You need a little help. If I was going to suggest someone, I would say I pulled heavily from a couple of things in our series, because I've realized as we've been talking about this, I needed to do some research. So what I have used, in addition to some of Bion's shorter writings, is the Jacobus Book, as I mentioned, and I believe that book is, let's see, where's that book at? Jacobus, where are you? I have it written somewhere.
I tend to pull from, I know the author's name, I forget the books and the essays because I've read so many. but he has a collection on Bion, and I believe his name is James Groston or something like that. I forget exactly how to say his name. But he is considered the expert on Bion. He's been doing this for a long time, apparently.
Yeah, I would say the webpage when I'm at the Institute of British Psychoanalysis is actually pretty useful. And what's the Jacobus book? I'm so blanking on what it's called. Let's see, Jacobus. I think I even said it earlier.
Right.
I would also read Yawam, The Theory and Practice of Group Psychotherapy, 3rd edition, if you can find it, particularly because that's a lot of Bion. And then the Jacobus book is.
I had to check real quick, but his name is
The Poetics of Psychoanalysis from 2005.
That's right.
That's what it is.
There you
It's
go.
Mary Jacobus, which a whole lot of it's devoted to Bion, particularly the weird shit at the end. And it's been the only thing I've found that like kind of sort of gave me kind of a way in.
Yeah, James Groston, and I had to check to make sure that was the right way to say it. But he's good, but you are going to have to trudge through that a lot. I had to do a lot of my own research related to that. Some of the stuff that I had actually sent you was the stuff that I was reading through just to try to work with him on some things. Like one of his books is The Exploration of the O. I haven't bought that. I kind of don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be the part of Bion that's going to send you off the edge.
Right.
I think Nicola Glover has a book that's not about Bion particularly. It's actually about all of British psychoanalysis, and you can find it for free online, like if you like legally.
Legally.
It is called The Psychoanalytic Aesthetics, the British School, and chapter 4 is called The Legacy of Wilfred Bion, and I also referenced the shit out of that in our conversation today. So if people want to read more, I mean, I would say read Bion, but like with all my favorite psychoanalysts, like Adler or Klein or Fink, even the American Lacanians, you actually are gonna need some help to get into their particular framework because, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, there's a whole lot of concurrent development in psychoanalysis with other fields. And so, like, I often find that psychoanalysis has a concept, but there are already concepts in philosophy or sociology that cover the same things and are more readily understood. And I'm always trying to figure out, do I need to stick to the specific psychoanalytic concept because it's important conceptually that it's actually different? Or is this just a convergent, like, evolutionary thing? Right. And these people have just come up with different ways to describe the same thing, and all the language is alienating to normies. So, just pick one.
I was going to say it's interesting that you brought up Adler. I just started reading him.
I think, like, if people are going to get into psychoanalysis, I actually think Adler is one of the. I mean, he's not really a psychoanalytic thinker by the end of his life, but his ideas of freedom and existential psychology are, I think, very, very useful, even if you have like a bio feedback view of what a human being is. And I do. So, like, for example, one of the reasons why I think the idea sets don't really change while social context does is that I actually do believe in something called human nature. But I think, but I also think that human nature is so mitigated by what I actually think are biological impulses as mammals, really, are so mitigated by complex social circumstances that saying what human nature is in any given scenario and extrapolating from that scenario to all of human nature is useless. So we know that humans may behave a certain way in certain constraints, and that is predictable and different time periods. But what we cannot say is we know what humans are going to do under any constraint from those certain constraints. And and my favorite example of this is always like the kind of infamous wolf example. All wolf biology and sociobiology is wrong because it was based off rules in captivity, and when we study wolves in the wild, they don't act the same way at all. And so, like, the alpha, beta, omega distinctions that we see in wolves in captivity don't apply to wolves in the wild. And I think that's true of humans. I think a lot of times we over extrapolate from a particular constraint on human species being, to use Marxist terms.
Right.
So I don't get into the human nature confusion. And this is even at a biological level. So, for example, there are enzymes that are triggered by gene expressions that can make one more violent. But if they're not triggered by a traumatic experience in childhood, those people are actually less violent than people without the same violent gene, in quotations, etc.
Right.
So the constraints literally change the way your biology reacts. Now, I thus take an existentialist view of all this now, even though I think, existentialism in some ways gets written off as the basic bitch of philosophy by people who don't want to deal with Heidegger and who haven't read that much of Sartre. And you know that because most people think like Sartre's making the same claims as Ayn Rand.
Yeah,
it's like
or somebody tells me that Sartre believes in free will. It's like, no, he does not, and I'm gonna have to fight you now.
He doesn't really even believe that like free will is a like. I think in the Sartrean conception, the question is stupid, right? It's not that we have determined will or free will. Is that the whole question presumes a whole lot of things that we can't presume.
Right. Well, the very beginning of Being and Nothingness is him just knocking down dualisms. And one of the dualisms is free will and determinism. And what's funny is people will say he believes in free will. It's like he quotes Spinoza favorably several times before saying that technically, like he doesn't say this, but from an aerial view is what he would mean. Determinism makes more sense. What he's against is psychological determinism, and not determinism in the sense of like biological determinism, but like in the sense that, if I'm hungry and the only food that's there is, I don't know, a jar of pickles, I'm probably going to eat that. And he describes it in a much better way than I just did. But he definitely breaks that down. Because, when people are like, oh, he believes in radical freedom, it's like when he talks about freedom, he talks about autonomy. And you can kind of, the way I came to understand it is like autonomy is kind of like an automaton. For him, freedom, I don't want to relate it to Schopenhauer because it's not exactly the same, but freedom is kind of just it's just us going. We're constantly desiring things. We're going. I guess, which is not the best explanation for it, but it's the most anyway. But yeah, so basically, as far as I understand, for Sartre, the will usually acts against freedom. It creates determinations, is what he says. So. What's revealing about that is Simone de Beauvoir, and I never say her name right, talks about, which book? I want to say The Ambiguity, but it might not be. She says that the will to power, she basically rejects the will to power by saying everything's too weak. And so for Sartre, the interesting thing is that the will is not free. The will is not free. You're free regardless of how, free or unfree your will is, how much you want to will yourself to do something, which is why, he has such an emphasis on nothingness. And so I'm trying to pick, the best way he explains it. Well, I'll put it this way. There's one point in Being and Nothingness where, to kind of go against the Ayn Rand thing, he says all voluntary acts are lies. Basically, anything you do voluntarily, anything you will, is technically a lie, because as far as he's concerned, you're free. And to will something is to try to kind of determine yourself. You're trying to do something very specific. You have a goal, which is why his idea of having a goal is so important later on, especially in the psychoanalysis, because a lot of people don't get that when he says existence precedes essence, it doesn't mean there is no essence. It means that you exist first, and then you create who you are. And for him, you kind of end up creating your own prison. It's like in his play, The Chips Are Down, where there's two people who die, and then they're allowed to go back to the world, and they're told that they can only live there if they totally leave their lives behind and go elsewhere, and they can't. They just can't do it. So this would take up a whole nother video of me trying to describe freedom. But yeah, as for your point on human nature, I agree. I think that human nature, generally speaking, I kind of see it as social influences mitigated by biological impulses. You live in a society or an approximation towards or near other people. You have certain biological desires, things you want to do, and the social influences, mitigate that or exasperate that depending on where you are and what kind of culture shows up. And so that's the simple version, but that makes it extremely complicated, because like evolution for me is always going. And so if you live in a society where you repress certain biological functions or desires or whatever, it changes them. I guess that's kind of close to Nietzsche, but it's more complicated than saying all people want something, because they don't. That's why propaganda for me, whenever somebody says, oh, the propaganda has made all these people not believe whatever, it's like, no. Propaganda is one set of ideas that hits a bunch of different people with a bunch of different perspectives, and so there's a bunch of different reactions to it. But
yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. Sorry, we're over time here a little bit.
Well, and that's fine. I'm known to go for very long, but I'm just trying to stay within the confines of one topic.
Right.
So yeah, we can go into more of that later. I think we probably should go back and do another episode on what all's going on in Sartre, and then maybe one on cynicism. So I'll be in touch with you. Thank you so much for coming on, and take care.
Yeah, you too.